Good evening and welcome everyone to this last lecture of the church series. My name is Abigail Sachs. I am the chair of the Graduate Architecture Program, and I'm here representing Jason Young, who unfortunately had a family commitment that he had to honor. We all have to balance between life and work. But I'm actually very glad for myself. It gives me the opportunity to introduce today's speaker, Jennifer Akerman, and to spend a few moments giving you a bit of context into which to understand, or at least to begin to understand, Jennifer's work. So I was reading something this morning, an editorial that was written in 1936, and it listed all the ways in which professional practice was changing and how it's time to be listening to the students and listening to people who have new ideas. And I think it's very easy to see the parallels and to see the ways in which in the beginning of the 21st century, though it's not really the beginning anymore, just the early, we're facing a lot of similar challenges. Just to mention a few: environmental challenges, ongoing social questions that have not been resolved, and especially new labor relations, which have been brought up by the internet and by other ways of doing business. And the list can go on. And I think that, like, as in the editorial I was reading, the point is to listen to new voices, not to give up on the commitment to architectural practice or give up on the commitment to the importance of design, but at the same time to challenge it, to think about it, and to look at it critically. And that is exactly what Jennifer Akerman does. She's a 2019 to 2021 UTK James Johnson Dudley Faculty Scholar, and she explores these questions through the idea of living architecture, which frames buildings as part of a larger ecosystem, including urban agriculture, induced biohabitation, and crafted microclimates. I think that if you take the idea of living architecture to its logical end, you realize that one of the big challenges is to the authority and to the control that we have as architects. And I think that that will come out in Jennifer's work and is an important part of it. Jennifer brings a lot of expertise to the role of James Johnson Dudley Faculty Scholar. She has a degree from Princeton University, a Master of Architecture, which she received in 2002, where she worked with a range of theoreticians and practitioners: Liz Diller, Peter Eisenman, Ben Van Berkel, and Caroline Boss. She also studied at the University of Virginia, where she received a Bachelor of Science in Architecture in 1998 and was commended by the School of Architecture there by the faculty for her design work. In addition, she brings a lot of architectural experience. She progressed from being an intern to an architect to a designer and then to an associate. Intern architect to designer to associate, apologies, at Hillier Architecture in Princeton, New Jersey, which is now called Studio Hillary and RMJM. And one of the projects that she worked on, the Becton Dickinson Campus Center, won the Excellence Award from AIA Pennsylvania in 2014. She was also a project architect and a design coordinator here in Knoxville at Corcoran Design and Planning, now known as Red Chair Architects. And there I noticed that 3 schools that she was in charge of won honor and merit awards from the AIA East Tennessee: the Allgood Elementary School, the Morrison Elementary School, and the Prescott Elementary and Middle School. Jennifer brings all of this work together into teaching architectural studio and other courses that explore materiality, constructions, and special topics of professional practice, especially the critical practice. And central to all of this has been the Beardsley Community Farm Design Build project, about which I'm sure we're going to hear more because it's right up here in the image. And I think that this is a very admirable example of someone bridging between one practice, the practice of practicing, of working, of marshaling resources and bringing about the construction of the building, and the critical evaluation of the process and the sharing of the work, which, as I pointed out at the beginning, is at the heart of what Jennifer does. Just to illustrate how this project bridges between these two, in 2017, it won the Award of Excellence from the AIA Tennessee State Awards Program, the Gold Award from the Brick and Architectural National Awards Program, and, importantly in my opinion, the Collaborative Practice Award from the Association of Collegiate School of Architecture. But it was also the topic of publications, especially Crafting Production, Design Build as an Alternative Practice, which Jennifer published in the Journal of Architectural Education, again in 2017, And a year later, it was followed by the Engage project, Representation, Dissent, and the Architecture of Public Space, this in the Plan Journal in fall 2018. Outside of Knoxville, Jennifer has visited many schools as a reviewer. I'll just list a few: Virginia, Kentucky, Michigan, and Berkeley. I had to finish there. And finally, if you'll allow me a final personal note, Jennifer is such a generous teacher and such a generous colleague. And I think that we are all very lucky here to have you here in the college. I was reading this morning about current psychological research highlighting the importance of humility as a basis for openness and for conversation and for discussion. And I think you exemplify this. Thank you, Jennifer.
Gosh. Thank you, Abigail, for such a lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. This is my pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you all tonight about my work as part of the church lecture series. I'm happy to begin tonight by recognizing and thanking people who have supported my work here as an assistant professor. Dean Poole, thank you very much for the opportunity to teach here and for your support of my work. I'm so grateful to the School of Architecture Director Jason Young for his guidance on how to perform well as a faculty member and for his continual efforts to elevate what I do, what we all do, in the spirit of advancing the culture of design. Tricia Stuth, thank you for serving diligently as my mentor throughout this whole process, which has been incredibly helpful, as well as thank you to all of the people who have served as informal mentors over the years. I'd love to thank all the faculty I've had the pleasure to teach with, to serve with on committees, and to have as allies in elevating the discourse of design. Quickly, thanks as well to the full administrative team of the college for ensuring that things get done well. And finally, thank you to our students, without whom none of this would be possible or relevant. And I know I can't thank everyone by name right now, but I'm greatly appreciative of collaborating with you all. Thank you for being here. So to get started, let me, second one? Number three. Is this dark enough or should I go darker? Let's do it here. All right, great. Awesome. All right, great. Well, tonight's talk will focus on a few lines of architectural inquiry, pulling from creative work, from designist research, from scholarship, and from teaching, all of which are intertwined for me. The talk will necessarily be incomplete, representing just some of what I have tried to contribute to the school, the college, and the discourse of architecture. Well, sorry. Okay. Let's see if this is working. All of my work is grounded in a field that I call critical practice. I define critical practice as tactics of the engaged architectural project, and it includes any work in the built environment driven by a critical agenda. I expect works of architecture to have a thesis, a line of inquiry that expands architecture's capacity to be meaningful. Through my research of design practice, I advocate for an everyday critical practice, which I define as work that cares for cultural issues, that is intentional in its design methods, and that embeds a critical agenda wherever possible, even in modest works of architecture. Buildings can function more resiliently in concert with their environments and in intertwined ecologies, mitigating negative impacts on their climate, watershed, and dependent flora and fauna. They can resonate with cultural histories and become agents of social justice by giving shelter and venue to people who have been habitually excluded from design. Architecture can provocatively engage complex social questions and catalyze recognition and response from the people who encounter it. Those of us who care about architecture in the world should insist on criticality in contemporary practice. My commitment to this position was first inspired by the work of my professors, including, as Abigail mentioned, Liz Diller, Peter Eisenman, Paul Lewis, and others. Rather than treating theory as something reserved for the seminar, these architects also bring theoretical insights and challenges to the status quo into the design studio. And they find ways of being fundamentally critical in their professional practices. My scholarship, creative work, and teaching examine why, in almost any U.S. market, clients rarely understand the capacity for architecture to do more. Why do architects rarely succeed in defending the idea that our buildings can do more? The exceptions, works of critical architecture, are usually produced by curious and passionate architects working with the most elite clients in large cities with extraordinary budgets, sympathetic consultants, and brilliant designers. But what about places like Tennessee? What is the capacity for architecture to operate critically, even with limited budgets and with clients who may be unaware of inspiring precedents? How can we make everyday criticality something of clear value to everyone? To position myself relative to these issues, I'm someone who looks at critical practice both as an academic and a practitioner. I've worked in various types of architectural offices for 9 years before I started teaching full-time. I'm a licensed architect, I'm a lead AP, I'm an AIA member. I've worked on high-end residential, institutional, commercial projects in and around Boston and New York. I've worked on extremely low-budget projects, public projects, such as this one in Middle Tennessee. If we fail to pursue solutions for providing everyday criticality, engaged architecture will remain the exception, a luxury commodity only available to the elite, and architecture will further devalue in the eyes of the public. I work with brilliant students, and I strive to instill a fascination with criticality in each of them, such that when they are ready, they will act critically whenever they decide to practice and whatever form that work takes. I see the call for everyday critical practice as an opportunity for emerging designers to transform practice. Sometimes that means pursuing alternative modes of practice in order to build a public desire for more critical work. Architect Liam Young visited our college about 3 years ago to lecture and to introduce a pretty amazing exhibition of his films in the Ewing Gallery. He claims that he can have a greater impact on the field of architecture by making films exploring the complexity of the near future and its speculative architecture than he could by designing physical buildings. By speculating on engaged critical practice, I strive to make meaningful design something people everywhere have a desire for and an opportunity to experience. So in 3 themes, examples of which I will share tonight, I've explored the potential for everyday critical practice in my work conducted while teaching at UT. The first is the potential for design-build project delivery to bring high aspirations and a high level of craft to architecture at a lower cost. The second involves expanding on the definition of a work of architecture in order to increase the designer's capacity to act critically. And the third is in my own industrial practice of engaged craft, which explores how emerging tools of digital fabrication could position designers as fabricators able to produce work directly through alternative workflows and inverted power structures. To start, I'm going to tell the story of the Beardsley Community Farm Design Build project. This project was led by our students and faculty through a series of design studios and seminars that I co-taught and ran in collaborations with other faculty and research assistants beginning in 2014. And I hope many of you here tonight are familiar with Beardsley Farm. This project has really been a pretty tremendous effort that has enrolled the help from many, many people, many of whom I'm sure are here with us this evening. The project for Beardsley is a nonprofit sustainable farm in the Knoxville's Mechanicsville community. They've been operating with very limited resources for almost 20 years. What we ultimately produced was a new building that serves as their home base and front door. It's an iconic entry point that grounds a complex site where they manage about 4 acres of productive farmland located in an urban park. Programmatically, the building includes a multi-purpose classroom, administrative offices, bathrooms, and a series of support spaces, and it's actually really ambitious for this type of design build effort. When I use the term design build, I mean efforts where students enrolled in coursework are able to design and build architecture in the world, usually working closely with a user group or client. And we have a rich history of such projects in our college, such as the examples I'm showing here, which I hope many of you have been able to be a part of. Design Build is situated in an interesting scene between architecture as professional practice, architecture as an educational learning experience, and architecture as discourse. Innovation created through these collaborations has the potential to change how we teach, how we practice, and how we think about architecture. This project represents multiple lines of ideas for architecture. It has multiple critical agendas. The architecture explores issues of food networks, architecture in an expanded milieu, meaning thinking of the project as being more than a building, but rather as a system of relationships. Design Build education, alternative forms of practice, public work, engaged craft, social justice, and sustainability. And we could also consider it as a building. It works on that level too. But for now, I'll claim that the main goal was to explore architecture's capacity to enhance community engagement. We strove to develop an architecture that could help the farmers engage the community they seek to serve, making the farm more present, more visible, more permanent, but also creating places for community and dialogue and enhancing public space. One claim I'm making is that this type of design build work constitutes a new form of architectural practice, one where students emerge as leaders, using analytic tools to identify significant problems and opportunities, and then designing to engage those issues. We achieved a very high level of design for a simple public building, pushing the opportunity to design for more people. Projects based in community engagement and socially responsive design can help students develop a deep sense of agency and responsibility as leaders in the profession. These qualities are fundamentally important to both the education of an architect and to the future of architecture. So these were some of our intellectual allies in the field of engagement-focused work: Peggy Deemer, John Carey, Sam Mockbee, among others. A common theme among this set is the desire to serve communities that normative professional practice overlooks and underserves, and practices who rethink how architecture might be delivered. We took this central idea of the rural studio to heart. Architecture, more than any other art form, is a social art and must rest on the social and cultural base of its time and place. For those of us who design and build, we must do so with an awareness of a more socially responsive architecture. And William Carpenter talks about the relationship of thinking and making, claiming the construction studio as the key moment for, quote, thoughtful making. Students who experience design-build education develop a deep, embedded understanding of the connection between idea, implementation, and outcome. There's a fundamental difference, obviously, between learning about a construction process in a book or from a lecture course versus learning how to build structural masonry walls in the field from a master craftsman. And not to take anything away from either approach, but these direct experiences absolutely help students conceptualize design differently. Our collaboration process was complex, led by the academic team of students and faculty, but depending on so many others, as I think this diagram perfectly captures. These relationships were constantly in flux, but the inherently horizontal structure is part of what helped us exceed bureaucratic and budgetary limits that often prevent high-quality public architecture from being possible. I want to acknowledge and thank everyone who is part of this team, and I'm also going to refrain from reading you the content of the diagram and instead reflect on the value of it, which to me really speaks about flexibility and leadership. That we learned that if we could prove our value to the key deciders by being insightful and dependable, we could step forward as the agent able to make fast decisions and to provide on-the-ground leadership needed to get things done. Our curricular structure was flexible and opportunistic because it had to be. Our continued involvement was always contingent, totally depending on good working relationships, as well as meeting budget and being able to meet or stretch the city's schedule. We could have been asked to leave at any point. This timeline diagram shows in detail the arc of our effort, and I'll mention about 50 students contributed through enrolled coursework, with 2 of those students, Bud Archer and Bailey Green, I think Bud is with us tonight, becoming critical research assistants post-graduation. And I also want to recognize Professor Bob French, who was a co-PI with me, co-teaching many of these courses, and was, of course, a tremendous inspiration for all of us. Outside of coursework, more than 50 additional students and faculty contributed as volunteers. So this had a structure that allowed people to plug in and be part of it throughout. All right, so to introduce Beardsley, we had a wonderful client. The Beardsley team inspired us to give all that we could for the project. They came to us with a pragmatic set of needs, which was to provide accessible toilets on the site and maybe a little office space. We attempted to do a lot more than that by reframing it as a project of engagement, and they embraced that direction wholeheartedly. Beardsley Farm promotes food security and sustainable agriculture through education and community outreach. They have a very small staff, but with the help of hundreds of volunteers, they generate 10,000 pounds of food annually. It's not a community garden. This is all a managed farm, meaning everything that's grown here is distributed to people in need through other nonprofits, like mobile meals, homeless shelters, halfway houses, and pantries. They also host hundreds of K through 12 students through field trips, teaching about sustainability and farming. So there's a very strong outreach mission, great intentions, great effort. And these images show you some of the incredible condition of having a productive farm in a public urban park. So this sort of condition of just crops growing alongside the park space. But even then, it was not a rosy, perfect scenario. When the farm was founded, the area was a food desert. Now it's not, largely due to Beardsley's work. Even so, at times there are tensions between the farm and the neighborhood. Wanting to affect change through food security and community outreach is not as easy as just building a farm and saying problem solved. We found that we had a lot to learn about the physical, social, and cultural context of the project. A few design issues were clear when we first visited. There was no entry point or sense of arrival to the farm, which originally the demonstration farm was behind a fence at the top of the hill, so it's topographically separated and physically separated by fences. We learned that acts of vandalism were committed against the farm somewhat regularly, meaning damage to the barn or to plants or knocking over beehives. And that led to fences and signs and heightened tensions and a loss of productivity. Our first day on site, the farmers were actually harvesting unripe tomatoes and then driving them a mile off campus to store them in an office building so that they wouldn't be stolen from the field or damaged. Our students were key in insisting that we could use design to address this complex social and spatial reality. And I'll mention, one of my journal articles goes into this idea in more depth, but vandalism is an interesting tactic of engaging the built environment. It can be a signal of bigger issues. We learned that vandalism doesn't typically happen at the mobile meals building or for other neighbors. So vandalism can be a tool for expression and dissent, especially when it gives voice to people who may be typically excluded from the power structures that tend to govern how architecture happens. Our mission was to shape the park for everyone, farmer and residents alike. And part of the critical practice at work here is the claim that architecture can reflect complex situations and make space for bigger conversations. Why are the tomatoes and bees behind fences? Why are there signs asking us to think about the people who will benefit from the food? But also, why isn't the city providing bathrooms and water fountains for the kids using the basketball court? And what is the impact of barriers, real or inferred, in the park? So this site plan illustrates some of that context in Mechanicsville, which is a historic neighborhood just northwest of downtown in UT. When it was developed in the 1860s, this area was home to skilled laborers, including many African Americans and immigrants. Green in this park represents the extents of the Malcolm Martin Park, which is named for Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. There's a greenway running through the park, connecting the residential areas of Beaumont and Mechanicsville, Beaumont and Lonsdale, down to the south along Western Avenue. The Food City and Pilot are here. We're probably down here right now relative to this. It's about a mile away, a mile north of us. Within the park, we have athletic fields, basketball, a public pool, but we also have a really interesting connection to other nonprofits, such as Mobile Meals. Beardsley's demonstration farm is here, the fenced area, but they also grow in about 4 additional acres throughout the park. Our addition is this yellow figure right there. We're adjacent to a public housing complex. We're very close by to a community center with a branch library. adjacent to the Lara Kanzler Learning Center, which has daycare and aftercare, a significant church and such. So it's a really, really fascinating context. And we're also immediately adjacent to Knoxville College, the campus of Knoxville College, which is a historically black college with enormous cultural and historic value, but whose future is currently uncertain and in flux. The Beardsley Junior High School had also been on this site, and that's where Beardsley Farm adopts its name. That school was closed during the restructuring of Knoxville City and Knox County schools in the 1980s, and it was demolished and replaced with the Mobile Meals building that sits here now. So, the loss of the Beardsley School and the radical transformation of Knoxville College have contributed to a destabilization in this neighborhood. Today, the median income in Mechanicsville is $9,000 a year, and food security is common. When our students volunteered at the farm during design, and when we were on site throughout construction, informal discussions with people in the park helped us understand some of those issues better. It also helped us understand some of the farm's needs and some of the site constraints and opportunities. This embeddedness was essential to our programming process and informed the fundamental design approaches. Design Integration Studio students worked collaboratively to arrive at a unified approach, converging 12 independent ideas into one design. Refinement of that idea continued from there on out, even through construction. Some key questions for us included, why aren't there more good public buildings, especially in low-income areas? What is the appropriate architectural expression of an urban farm? How might we take project limits as an opportunity to do more using less? How can design foster social interaction and engagement? And how can spatial definition foster a sense of belonging and placemaking? We wanted the design to be as open and inviting as possible to reflect that it's a farm for everyone. So again, for context, this is the outline of the existing demonstration farm. They had an existing plastic hoop house and an existing barn, but no other permanent structures. The greenway in the park is here, the basketball court right here, the daycare center is immediately next to us. So the new building hugs the edge of the demonstration farm and makes a new iconic presence for the farm. Trying to explicitly connect the education farm with the basketball court and the park, we created a very open outdoor classroom as the new front door to Beardsley, which you see in that image as well. We called the partie Rock and Tree, that by consolidating the conditioned footprint to the smallest area possible, here and here, making a masonry core, we could then expand the project through the big roof canopy, defining outdoor sheltered rooms and integrating the campus. The screen wall wraps the new entry threshold as well as the existing barn, so here to here, defining a mini campus. And we also address the topographic separation by creating a very simple earthen amphitheater to engage the greenway, making space for the public as much as it is for the farm, while connecting the farm to the park. And a wonderful thing happened at our final design review when the students were presenting this proposal in the fall semester, roughly in this form. And our client said that he loved the design because we made this metaphor of the big door a reality. This is a public farm. It's yours and it's ours. When the door is open, the farm is open, which was really powerful, I think, for our students to present the work and to hear the client articulate it back so cleanly was really nice. And this is the project completed and in use. Really quickly, one of the minor victories of the project is in how we engaged fences, which this image also shows. Fences couldn't just go away completely, but the city was at times inclined to wrap chain link fence all the way around this parking lot, around the entire complex. And so by advocating instead for this solution where the fence is layered onto the front facade, securing an open storage space and the main outdoor classroom, but then lining it with bamboo to help it read as a screen and to link the new architecture back to the existing structures. In this floor plan, I only want to orient you to the big door, the entry space, mudroom, and assembly space here as well, and emphasize that it was very compact. We understood that the farm needed flexibility to accommodate large groups of volunteers, And having a mudroom and outdoor work areas passively conditioned by the architecture extends the ability to work in this site year-round, which we also understood and appreciated firsthand as builders, working in the harsh summer and through the extremely cold winter. Our students were responsible for everything you see here. A significant amount of the masonry, the concrete lintels and sills, custom entry doors, signage, casework, and other details. And these images show our team at work on the project during construction. This was our classroom, which was really amazing. We had time on site to observe how the volumes of the building would play out. We could make adjustments and refine details. We were embedded with the farmers and their volunteers, which was continually instructive. The main core of the building is structural triple withe brick with an innovative inside-out construction technique. We sought to express the brick's performance by using Flemish bond and by articulating the precast lintels. Here you see we had the opportunity to have progress reviews like on site, which was pretty amazing, as well as some, this is showing the process of installing the fiber cement siding at the mudroom, details of the steel column bases, which we fabricated at the Fab Lab. Much of this was fabricated at the Fab Lab, I should say. Poplar entry doors, plywood casework, the bamboo process of harvesting and installing the screen wall. And throughout all of this, our students were incredibly good-natured and professional. Students in a digital fabrication seminar also designed strategies for housing beehives at Beardsley. Honey is the only product made at the farm that's sold to the public. The bees are also important workers on the farm, of course, pollinating all the crops. These folded steel wrappers are intended to be didactic, functional shrouds that would protect the bees from vandalism while educating people in the park about bees. Ultimately, we installed an observation beehive in the main classroom, which required drilling a 2-inch diameter hole through the 16-inch brick assembly. We built a modest earthen amphitheater using gay-beam baskets and bricks reclaimed from our construction waste and from a demolished building on the Knoxville College campus. This amphitheater was completed in May of 2019, and you get a sense of it in these images showing the integration of the new farm center with the rest of the park. We designed for sustainability comprehensively, caring for how architecture affects environmental, cultural, and social health. The project is pursuing LEED Silver certification, and we also address guidelines from the AIA's Committee on the Environment and the Living Building Challenge, finding it would be possible to achieve PETAL certification. This is also a tour plan that we proposed, understanding that the farmers give a pretty comprehensive tour to any new visitor explaining how the farm works. So we were locating moments where they might augment that tour by pointing out the architecture's sustainable features. Those include designing for natural daylight and views, facilitating education, harvesting rainwater for irrigation and for groundwater recharge, as well as carefully shaping exterior microclimates to extend the program of the project, and material reclamation and reuse. These images show the finished building and I think speak to the question, what should a modern urban farm be like? Spatially rich, Spartan, and honest in its materiality, perhaps appropriating materials from greenhouses, such as the polycarbonate clerestories. This project helps me value hybridized program. It matters that this is an urban farm in a park. The flows of agrarian life overlaid with the demands of running a nonprofit and hosting hundreds of volunteer visitors. The flows of recreational life of the neighborhood overlaid with the daycare and mobile meals. It's a really nuanced condition. I'm really pleased with the space making and the level of finish we were able to achieve. We approached it like designing a ship. Every surface does some work. Every space is multi-purpose. Sam Mockbee spoke of the role educators hold to remind the student of architecture that theory and practice are not only interwoven with one's culture, but with the responsibility of shaping the environment, of breaking up social complacency, and of challenging the power of the status quo. Pedagogically, the project helps us instill an ethical sensitivity into our students to consider the consequences of how they choose to work. The fact that the project exists signals a failure in conventional delivery methods. We were only invited to be here because traditional paths could not deliver a high level of design at the city's budget. John Kerry writes, quote, "Community, humanitarian, and pro bono design, indeed the public interest design movement as a whole, evolved in response to the failure of the mainstream architectural profession to serve a much larger percentage of people than it has historically." Because of the academic team's leadership, the city went further than they would have in backing a project that foregrounds engagement and design excellence. But pressure within the collaborating team to fulfill differing goals, quality versus budget versus schedule, limited what could be achieved. Tensions between the farm and neighbors remain, evidenced by sporadic vandalism that still occurs. But now when the farm is open, basketball players visit to seek shade, get water, and use the restroom, suggesting the architecture is eroding boundaries and facilitating dialogue between the farm and the community it seeks to serve. This project, of course, has an enormous team that, I mean, it's a really, really remarkable collaborative effort and would not have been possible without everyone's time and volunteers. And the Beardsley Project asks us to think of architecture as more than the building, and to consider how the construct performs as part of the metabolism of its extended environment. That's a good transition for talking about a condition I call living architecture, which is the focus of my current research. Work in this field explores productive exchanges between architecture and living agents. This framework positions architecture as a living construct, always situated within a greater environment, and where the building itself is a hybrid of artifact and animating agents. Rather than framing the architectural object as singular, heroic, and a static creation, living architecture is characterized by flux. The building itself and one's experience of it continually change in ways that far exceed what architects typically consider. I explore architecture's role within an active ecosystem of people, living organisms, environmental phenomena, as well as in relation to infrastructural networks of water, food, energy, transportation, and information. These agents animate the built project in ways that are unpredictable, surprising, and elusive. Some of the intellectual allies in the field of living architecture include David Gisson in his book Subnature, Sean Lally practice Weathers, Francois Roche in many projects, Donna Haraway's A Cyborg Manifesto, Kate Orff and David Benjamin. I would position my own graduate thesis work here too. Living architecture includes many subfields, and of those I'm most interested in exploring food networks, soft boundaries, expanded milieux, biodiversity and cohabitation, engaged craft, and the tactics of indeterminacy. My interest in food networks extends into using architecture and its byproducts, such as wastewater, process heat, or solar exposure, to cultivate and distribute food. And though I largely spoke of the Beardsley Project as a design, build, teaching, and learning experience, I also see it as a living construct. That's true both in how the farm produces food and shares it with others, but also in how it builds on existing relationships between a nonprofit agency and the thousands of people that are affected by their labor. I've taught several upper-level design studios exploring architecture's capacity to be the site and catalyst for urban agricultural production, understanding farms and buildings as ecosystems of nested loops. Imagining vertical farms as public space in urban settings, and exploring hybrid civic programs. And these explorations predated but also informed the Beardsley Project, I would say. Living architecture sees the architectural project as a hybrid, built artifacts that are animated by dynamic agents, including plants, animals, weather, and other phenomena. Caring for the expanded milieu takes the form of designing structures for both human and non-human occupants in the hopes of broadening biodiversity rather than limiting it, as is too often the result of architectural action. I ask students to rethink the role of enclosure and to explore the wall's capacity to selectively admit light, breeze, view, water, and other environmental agents. The field of living architecture also engages methods of fabrication and material systems with inherent instability or unpredictability. Cladding materials that change with the weather or degrade over time, casting concrete into unstable formwork, or engaging chance practices. Material research based on indeterminacy and chaos is the basis of several beginning design studios I've taught, and also inform a book chapter I've written for an upcoming edited volume on design pedagogy. Students used full-scale concrete maquettes to study indeterminacy caused by systems that they designed, including the continual degradation of plastic inserts, voids created by dissolving sugar cubes, and voids created by melting ice. Enrolling chance practices or random outcomes also has a rich history in contemporary art and poses a fascinating challenge to the nature of architectural specification by exposing the limits of a design team's control. That's a preview of the initial framework, and the topic of living architecture is the basis of my ongoing research project as the James Johnson Dudley Faculty Scholar, which I hope will produce a symposium and publication. Architects are unusually good at conveying confidence, in providing answers, in solving problems. Designers need confidence to act when making any creative work, and within the discipline of architecture, certainty is valorized as a necessary condition, the prerequisite for designing in the built environment. I'm saying this is an illusion. We have positioned architecture as a constant and bedrock, letting buildings become symbols of cultural values that are assumed to endure. Many forms of architectural work are predicated on control and conformance to anticipated outcomes. Yet through strategic introduction of unpredictability, architecture can become far more nimble, adaptable, and interesting than false certitude allows. Giving the increasing instability and uncertainty of many aspects of life, political frameworks, climate change, global economics, the illusion of control implied in architectural discourse and practice is ripe for reevaluation. I will conduct further research and scholarship exploring methods of animating the design and fabrication process to produce architectures that are radically engaged with their constituent and resultant atmospheres. This seeks to desimplify the architectural project by examining its embeddedness within complex systems. I see architecture as enrolling the building's method of production, its value to the people affected, its potential as habitat for non-human agents, and its capacity to contribute to networked ecosystems both close and far away. This ongoing project is a strategic pivot, linking ideas found in the Beardsley Farm project into further research exploring everyday critical practice through living architecture, work that could significantly inform how educators, practitioners, and the public think about architecture. In addition to the specific examples of engaged craft shared previously, I explore engaged craft at the scale of product design through my industrial design practice, Akerworks. While I won't go into much detail tonight, our work specializes in making tools for handcrafts, such as knitting and spinning. We also make musical instruments, and occasionally we make toys. We use computational design and fabrication to produce heirloom quality, beautiful functional objects. Careful consideration of fabrication processes reinforce an embodied understanding of craft and supports the architect's role as designing for specific cultural needs while re-examining ideas we may otherwise take for granted. The last set of ideas I want to share tonight is about my teaching. The field of architecture is complex and continually changing. Architecture sits between the sciences and the humanities. We care for craft, engineering, construction techniques, material behavior, as well as art, cultural studies, ethics, and the psychology of space. We teach students the fundamentals of how and why one builds within our obligation to protect health, welfare, and safety, But beyond that, I argue that the main instructional responsibility is to produce agents who care about pushing the field of architecture further and who will discover new ways of practicing architecture. Tomorrow's architects will determine how the field of architecture evolves. As a teacher, I feel we should not expect students to solve problems so much as we should help them explore problematic conditions and use their insights to generate innovative design and architectural thought. I approach this in my teaching by exposing students to many ideas and approaches, counting on their curiosity to drive them further. I think architectural teaching and architectural practice should be more critical and expansive, seeking to open up more questions than are answered. The goal of architectural education should be to cultivate designers who, when ready, will act critically in whatever they do. I reflect on my teaching specifically and on design pedagogy broadly, using conferences and journals as opportunities to expand themes from teaching into forms of scholarship. I teach design studio in both the undergrad and graduate architecture programs. I've taught in all levels, actually, though in recent years I primarily taught beginnings and endings. As I talk right now, I will show some work from the first-year undergraduates to give a sense of the range of work and the kind of experimentation I ask them to conduct. It's model-heavy. The direct haptic experience of making physical artifacts to explore an idea allows students to make discoveries that far surpass their intentions for the study. We also draw quite a lot, sketching diagrams, digitally drafting and modeling, and developing representations of the design proposal. My approach to criticality is very similar, whether teaching beginning students or soon-to-be graduating students, which is that I welcome and foster their curiosity about issues that they genuinely care about. I've directed the fifth-year self-directed project for the past few years, letting me strategically apply my expertise in critical practice to help students develop their own thesis work. I push for each thesis to be thoughtful, to thoughtfully explore complex issues that are truly significant to each student and also to society at large. I frame the thesis experience as research through design making, and it requires an argument or position from each student. Students should support that argument by finding intellectual allies, whether through literature review or analyzing precedents. The thesis must be situated. Each student should produce spatial and material responses to test their position. The thesis must be rigorous in its thinking and making, culminating in a final exhibit of exceptional representations that are as complex and rich as the issues being examined. And I have been really fortunate to co-teach thesis with Professor Marshall Prado last spring and informally with Julie Beckman last fall. Many other faculty contribute to this effort throughout design reviews and such. So I want to represent, I provide a certain amount of leadership, but I think the students are operating on a set of ideas they've been working on and learning on for 10 semesters. I will be really brief talking about a few examples here. But Subbu Bandari's thesis, titled Identity Crisis, explores architecture as a political tool. Her project responds to issues of identity as formed by borders, conflict, and displacement along multiple sites in the Pakistan-India border. The project operates at the scale of infrastructure, landscape, and network systems. The project reimagines the territory defined by the border zone, pushing and pulling it, animating it with a series of productive landscapes, transportation systems, and strategically developed buildings. Aubrey Andrews' thesis, titled Time Operative Space, explores architecture's relationship to knowledge in light of contemporary information flows inherent to the catalog and database. The project imagines the library as city and embraces themes of fluidity, flux, memory, and exchange. Her methodology included building artifacts that retain a memory of how they were made, especially working with phase change materials. Sam Sowell's thesis, titled Pollinating Architecture, explores architecture capacity to build worlds based on narrative in the lineage of John Haydock and Timescape Lab. And the work is part science fiction, part love story, part speculative architecture. Her project embraces themes of flux, architecture, landscape entanglement, object-oriented relationships, and the power of drawing. Maggie House's project, Erasive Agencies, explores informal architecture in draw spaces of Knoxville as a tool for building agency within larger systems of control. The project questions politics, erasure, capitalism, and excess, and it relies on tactics of the parasite, camouflage, propaganda, and performative domesticity. Olivia Poston's thesis titled Grit, or In Praise of Palimpsest, explores architecture and preservation, looking at architecture as a centuries-long project. And it proposes a metabolism for transferring material and labor across sites of everyday programs and places. Kyle Johannes' project, Recalculating, conceives of the city as a living metabolism of fulfillment, exploring emerging technologies of micromobility, instant delivery, and home sharing. Adam Smith's project, called Borderlands, explores architecture as a political tool, situating architectural interventions to occupy, subvert, or camouflage events of everyday life along the U.S.-Mexico border. These speculations inhabit the border territories of airspace, river, and shadow. Brianna Rayner's thesis explores architecture's capacity to promote social justice and agency through tactics of representation and reappropriation, acting against historically exclusionary policies limiting ownership and membership. And finally, James Hallowell's thesis titled Procedural Everything was incredibly expansive and involved producing hundreds of artifacts. His work explores conditions of hybridity and indeterminacy, using procedural generation in many forms to challenge the entangled relationships of architecture and landscape, and of nature and culture. I think these projects offer many examples of how you can take a concern for an issue, study it diligently using the tools and mindset of an architect. Though these happen to be wildly speculative projects, each explores a contemporary idea grounded in a situation that has scale, materiality, a connection to place, and they are each animated by the circumstances of their use. So the talk tonight is focused on three main themes, all of which are explorations on the potential for an everyday critical practice. This was explored through a complex design-build effort at Beardsley. It's explored a little more theoretically through the ideas of living architecture, and it's explored through my teaching approach. By challenging the norms of conventional practice and the politics that support it, my work seeks to help others consider architecture as something of value for everyone, and it seeks to accomplish this in large part by encouraging students to insist on a critical agenda embedded in their work at all scales. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Do we have a bit of time for questions?
Sure, yeah. So you'll be official.
Jennifer, I'm curious to know where the interest in like theme of food came from in your work, and especially working with like less fortunate portions of the population on that issue.
I think those emerged in two separate moments. My graduate thesis was actually about food and thinking about food in the city and how it systems of production and where it comes from, and that kind of like recognition that I'm sure we've all had of like, oh my gosh, if California leaves, we're in trouble, right? That so much food is produced actually far, far away. And so I think to me food is one of those kind of amazing cultural subjects that draws together ritual, environment, place, landscape, architecture. You know, it kind of captures all of those themes. Beardsley happens to also just be a kind of fascinating, subject. I mean, I think to me the kind of thinking about the ways, who does architecture serve, right? Like, who is architecture for? And the broad idea that architecture is a representation of our values And so if it is not available to a large group of people, what does that say, right? So I think that those two things, they're kind of like different strands that have gotten to overlap at certain moments. Thanks.
Yes, I'm interested in the theme of the everyday because I think you talk about a lot of, and you're interested in a lot of elements that are everyday items, yet there's a sort of tension between the everyday and the pushing of the conceptual and the ethical agenda.
Yeah, it's kind of both, right? It's trying to be looking for the potential to act critically, which can take any project wherever it is, like trying to kind of meet a project on whatever terms are there, which I think can be like trying to valorize everyday rituals in certain ways. But I think also really pushing for how to kind of make that spectacular, to the extent that one can. So yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of both ends of a spectrum, perhaps. But I think that that's intentional, like trying to have both of those threads present.
And I'm also kind of interested in how the everyday might engage habitat, the everyday and habitat.
Mm-hmm.
What is habitat?
I most specifically thought of it relative to all of the kind of non-human agents and what they use and how they are kind of, how urban environments or any kind of act of architecture is going to affect an ecology, whether we thought of it or didn't. So habitat, I think, I'm often thinking of that from a kind of non-human standpoint, but that might also be that I, have not done much residential thinking lately. I mean, I think it could be interesting to kind of apply that also at a more human-focused level.
Jennifer, it was really interesting to see the thesis work and the relevancy of the social and political topics that were explored. Do you find that that's something that the students just naturally kind of are going towards, or is that a topic of conversation that you engage with at the beginning of class?
I've been really impressed. These are generally, every project I've shown, the set of issues are coming from the students, and a kind of optimism, yet concern for wicked problems, right? Social problems that, like a lot of dealing with, racism and climate change and, the end of the world and such, and which is like, but approaching it in a very kind of optimistic sort of way. So I'm not sure what that accounts for. I think that might be kind of a moment that we're in right now, that the students are thinking in such broad terms and feel empowered to try to use architecture to address social conditions.
Excellent. It should give us all hope, right?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was really great. And I just want to echo Abigail from earlier and just say thanks for being such a great colleague over the years. And everyone knows you to be just a really critically engaged person and a thoughtful person. We all appreciate that a lot. I just wanted to take stock of the whole thing and say that I think you're posing a linkage, let's say, between criticality and indeterminacy, maybe. So I think that's somehow embedded in your disposition as a person, like just as, okay, I don't think there's a simple answer to this thing, and yet I know there's a critical answer to this thing. And so I just wonder, like, if you could, I hope this is not too difficult, but if you could reflect on I don't know, the discipline or the school at large, and just say, you know, what you hope students are up to these days.
Thank you for that lovely question and observations. Yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic. I think that, I mean, part of it is born, part of my interest in criticality is born out of perhaps frustration with practice, or feeling like, feeling genuine concern for our students, and hoping that they don't get lost, right? That when they graduate, in some ways they will be perhaps, it's easy to fear that they would be intellectually overqualified for the work that might be ready to receive them. But that I think that because there are so many different ways one can practice, and so many ways to be nimble, and to kind of use your skills to turn the system upside down and to reform how practice can be, that there will be more and more opportunities for critical work to exist and to be precedents, so that people are more familiar with it and say, oh, we could do this in a different way. And so, like, I think that the students' energy and optimism is really exciting, and linking that with the tools that they have access to now, it's a pretty amazing time to be thinking about architecture at lots of different levels.
Jennifer, thank you very much again. We'll let you rest now.